Hello everybody, welcome to the first JBI Live webinar of 2021. My name is Dr. Timothy Barker and I am a research fellow here in transfer science at JBI based in Adelaide. Now, I'm going to be introducing Zach Munn today, but before we do, we just want to go through a little bit of housekeeping. Now, if you have any feedback about the webinar or about the process, please send that feedback to jbieducation@adelaide.edu.au. Now, before I introduce Zach, I do want to acknowledge that we are meeting on the traditional country of the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains, and we at JBI pay respect to their elders past and present. We recognise and respect their cultural heritage, beliefs and relationship with the land, and we acknowledge that they are of continuing importance to the Kaurna people living today. I also extend this respect to other Aboriginal language groups and other First Nations peoples. Okay, so before I introduce Zach and get into the core bit of this talk, just a little bit of promotion. If you want to tweet about this webinar, please use the hashtag JBI Live. If you want to mention JBI, please use @JBI Evidence-Based Healthcare. Zach's Twitter handle is @Zach Munn and mine is @Tim Q Barker. Okay, so without further ado, I would like to introduce Professor Zachary Munn. So Associate Professor Zachary Munn is the Director of the Transfer Science Program of the JBI and Systematic Review and Guideline Development Methodologist. In his role as Director of Transfer Science, Associate Professor Zach Munn leads the development and the coordination of the Institute's educational courses, the development of systematic review and implementation software tools, and the promotion and publication of the collaborations methodologies. A few disclosures. Zach Munn is the current chair of the International JBI Scientific Committee and has been involved in the conduct of dozens of systematic reviews. He is also the director of the JBI Adelaide Grade Centre, the first grade centre that was set up in Australia, and he is a GIN board trustee. So Zach, I would like to officially welcome you as the chair and convener of the JBI Predatory Publishing Working Group.
Great, thanks Tim. I'll just share my presentation. Fantastic. Well, thank you, Tim, for that very nice introduction. And thank you everyone for taking the time to join us today as we discuss an issue which I think is very interesting, predatory publishing and systematic reviews. And what I'd like to discuss today is really, well, what is the problem when we talk about predatory publishing and what should we do as systematic reviewers? This is a bit of an emerging field now. And at JBI, at least, we're getting a lot of questions about, well, what should we do with studies from predatory journals and how should we, or should we include them in our systematic reviews? So what we're trying to do is at JBI and with some colleagues from across the globe, we're trying to figure out, well, how do we tackle this problem? And what I'd like to present today is just an overview of predatory publishing and predatory journals, and then get into the work of our predatory publishing practices group at JBI and some of the solutions that perhaps we're looking to investigate. Now I would, because we are still trying to find out a lot or whatever we can about this issue, I would really encourage you all to share your experiences in the chat today. So if you have any experiences or knowledge regarding predatory publishing and systematic reviews and evidence synthesis, please do share those in the chat so that we can look at that after this webinar. And we'll also try to be quite interactive today as well. So we have a number of polls throughout this session and we're hoping to capture some useful information from those as well. So thank you again. Thank you all for coming along. I know that for some of you, the time is not that great. So I really appreciate everyone taking the time out of their day to join us this morning or afternoon or evening. Okay, all right. So let's get into it. So Tim's just mentioned some of my disclosures previously. So these are just some of my roles and potential conflicts of interest. And I would also like to acknowledge that I'm presenting on behalf of the JBI Predatory Publishing Practices Group today. Okay, let's get into predatory journals. And what we might do, just to start us all off and test the polling functionality, what I'd like to know from those of you who are on the webinar today have you ever been contacted by what you think may be a predatory publisher or journal? So a poll should have just popped up. I can see a lot of you are filling it in now, which is great. I want to see how many of you are actually being contacted by these groups or organisations. Okay, looks like a lot of people have voted. Thank you for doing that. Okay, I'll shut that now and let's have a look here. All right, so hopefully you can all see these results. So it looks like about 3/4 of you have been contacted by a predatory publisher or journal in the past. Okay, so that's very interesting. 1/4 of you don't think you have, and then there's a couple who are unsure as well. Very interesting. Thank you for contributing. So this is all very useful information to give us a bit more knowledge about the size of this problem as well, and we'll do a few polls throughout this session. But thinking about being contacted, well, I must admit that sometimes I feel famous, and this is not just because I'm the Director of Transfer Science at JBI, but in the last week, I've received in my email invitations to join editorial boards, emails inviting me to write a book or a book chapter. I've been invited to speak at many different conferences in quite glamorous locations, and many invitations to submit to journals. And it can make me feel a little bit famous. But then once you look into these actual emails, you start to see that perhaps I shouldn't actually feel that famous, and perhaps they're not actually coming from, let's say, legitimate organisations or people. And I can see this because when you delve into it, you can see that you're starting, well, I've been invited to speak at different conferences where I have no expertise or knowledge, or to submit to different journals, which I have really no standing in the field either. And what actually happens is I know a lot of people get absolutely inundated with these spam emails from predatory journals, predatory conferences, and other groups. And it can really be a huge waste of time on your email. And every day, despite having spam filters and junk filters in place, a lot of us are getting all of these different emails inviting us to submit to these journals where we might not actually have any expertise in the field, or to attend these conferences as well. I must admit, though, I was a little bit excited about this email to submit to the American Journal of Archaeology, because it was always a boyhood dream of mine to follow in the footsteps of Indiana Jones. So I did consider submitting to this one at least. But really, what I'm trying to say here is that just the work of these predatory publishers and the unwarranted solicitation of authors from any field to submit to their journals and to submit articles to their journals, it actually is a huge waste of time. If you think about the fact on any given day, you might spend 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes, maybe even more, just simply cleaning up your email inbox because you have received all of these spam emails. And then you multiply that over the course of a year. What a huge waste of time. Many of us academics and researchers already face a lot of time constraints in what we do. And there have actually been some studies that have looked at how this huge email burden can actually contribute to burnout as well. And there was also a study that actually calculated and provided a conservative estimate that just managing emails from these predatory journals is costing about $1 billion per year in just wasted time and resources. So it is a huge waste of time dealing with these emails from predatory journals, which is just one of the issues that they present. Now, we also, when we talk about predatory publishing, there are also book publishers, which we might refer to as vanity publishing, where you are invited to author a book via some of these groups, which we won't be discussing today, but do contribute to this email burden. There's also all of these fake conferences as well, invites, but what we'll be focusing on today and what our group is focusing on is predatory journals. So what is a predatory journal? So until relatively recently, we didn't actually have a definition of what a predatory journal is, although a lot of people had thoughts about what a predatory journal is until this article was published in Nature in December 2019. We didn't actually have a formal definition, but luckily we now do, and having a formal definition can really help us start to think about this problem and hopefully start to combat it as well. So this is a great definition of what a predatory journal is. Predatory journals and publishers are entities that prioritize self-interest at the expense of scholarship and are characterized by false or misleading information, deviation from best editorial and publication practices, and a lack of transparency, or the use of aggressive and indiscriminate solicitation practices. And this aggressive or indiscriminate solicitation is what I was mentioning through that email burden. Okay. So then my next question for everyone on the webinar today is whether you have knowingly or unknowingly actually published in a predatory journal. So I'll just launch that poll, and just a reminder, this is all anonymous, so we can't see who's voting. So please, of course, be as honest as you can be. And let's see, has anyone on the call actually published in a predatory journal? Okay, those results are coming in. Let's have a look now. Okay, let's see. So I'll share these results. So let's have a look here. It looks like 12% of people on the call have actually knowingly or unknowingly published in a predatory journal, whereas 76% have not. And then there's 12% who are actually unsure whether or not they've published in a predatory journal. And that's interesting. And we'll discuss this a little bit later on, because sometimes it can actually be hard to tell whether the journal is predatory or not. And we'll discuss this a little bit later on as well. Thank you for sharing. So let's keep going on. Now, I must admit, when I was preparing for this webinar, I started to think to myself, well, actually, have I ever published in a predatory journal? And I started to look back over some of my previous publications, and I thought, no, surely I haven't published in a predatory journal. But there was at least one where I looked at it and I thought, actually, that submission process was a little bit strange and a little bit different. And perhaps I've actually been like this lamb on the slide here. Perhaps I have been caught in the trap of predatory journals. So I went back and had a look. And the first thing I noticed is that in some of our correspondence with this publisher, with this journal, that the article processing charges were relatively cheap. And one thing we know is that when these predatory journals often do charge lower article processing charges. So straight away, I thought this was a little bit of a strange process to only have to pay $250 US. Also, the feedback that we received from peer reviewers, it seemed a little bit token, I think. It did go out, it seemingly did go out to peer review, and I think it really did go out to peer review, but it seemed, it didn't seem quite as, let's say, in depth as what I normally suspect or what I normally do get. Maybe it was just a fantastic article, who knows, but maybe there were some issues. And another big warning sign for me was that the actual editor who was corresponding with us had the name of a very famous golfer. Now, it wasn't Tiger Woods, but it was, and I'm not going to say the actual name, but it was someone of a similar profile. So once again, that was a bit of a warning flag. So then I started to look into, well, actually, is this publisher, Hindui, that we published with, is it actually a predatory publisher? And what I found was, well, maybe, perhaps once upon a time, it was a predatory publisher, but it seems like over time, it's actually improved its practices and standards over time. So like I said, there kind of is sometimes it is a little bit hard to tell whether you publish with a predatory journal or not. And it seems like this time, well, maybe we didn't actually publish with a predatory journal, but if depending on what your thresholds are for deciding whether a journal is predatory or not, well, maybe we did. And it can be difficult to distinguish between predatory and legitimate publishers. So then I was interested by this issue about, well, who else other than me, perhaps, is actually publishing in predatory journals, or has been caught out, perhaps, by publishing in a predatory journal. And in this fantastic article, once again in Nature, it was identified that this is actually a global issue, and that authors from everywhere around the world are submitting and publishing in predatory journals. So this is a real issue. Sometimes it was thought that this was just an issue that was specific to lower resource settings, but this article certainly found that it is truly a global issue. It's also been found that a lot of the people who have submitted to predatory journals actually haven't heard of predatory journals or this phenomenon in the past. So they're not even aware that predatory journals exist. In terms of funding bodies, which what I found was quite surprising, was that the largest funder of a research that is published in predatory journals is actually the US National Institutes of Health. And in terms of what universities or what researchers from what universities are publishing in here, well, even top universities have authors who have published in these predatory journals as well. And then the question really is, well, why? Why are so many people publishing in these journals? And the first reason I think is just naivety. People don't actually realize that the journals are predatory, or don't even know that predatory journals exist. And particularly if they're a first-time author or an early career researcher or a novice when it comes to academic publishing, then they may not identify perhaps some of the warning signs when they are actually publishing. So they may not actually realize that the journals are predatory. Of course, there is this publish or perish mentality as well in academia and research, and the need to just get articles out and publish. And perhaps there are some people who are looking at these predatory journals as an easy way to get their publications up and to have let's say, a guaranteed publication. Somewhat linked to this, in some jurisdictions, there are incentives to publish more, and people actually get rewards or financial incentives based on how many publications they get. And depending on the systems that those jurisdictions have in place, they may not distinguish between legitimate or predatory journals and reward good publications in traditional journals the same as they would with publications in predatory journals. People may simply follow solicitation by these journals. So once again, when they get one of these emails that we talked about earlier, they may actually say, oh, okay, well, this looks like I'll be able to get this article in this journal quite easily. So they actually follow that pathway. And once again, it could be it's very easy to get published in these journals, and it may not necessarily be that the journals themselves are acting as the predators here, but the authors may be preying on predatory journals, or perhaps internet journals or journals that are just starting out and trying to get their publications published here. Another issue is that increasingly many of us are being pushed to publish in open access journals. And considering that the fees are lower for predatory journals, they may look like a more feasible option. And perhaps most worryingly is that you may be able to publish fraudulent, low quality, or error-ridden research or information in these journals as well. Just a note, and we'll come back to this once again, some of these journals that are classified as predatory may not necessarily be predatory in nature, but they may just be looking to, they may just be a new journal which is still finding its way. And then there may be authors who are looking to publish in these new journals or support these new initiatives as well. So we have some information about who is publishing in these journals and why they are publishing in these journals as well. And let's talk about why now this is such a big problem. So the huge issue is, the biggest issue is that the studies that are published in these journals do not often contain the information, the key information to advance science or care, or to contribute to that translational pathway of bench to clinical research and then obviously impact on a population. And some of the reasons why they don't contain this information or aren't useful to advance science or care is that the articles that are published in these predatory journals are often poorly conducted and not particularly well done. There are also reporting issues, and obviously a lot of these predatory journals don't adhere to reporting standards like those found on or supported by the Equator Network. And because they are so poorly reported, it's often not very transparent how the study was done, or it's not often very easy to understand the results or get the key information you would need to advance science or care. So this means that often the articles are of very low quality due to the lack of editorial processes and peer review. They may have potential errors, and perhaps more worryingly, there may also be some that are fraudulent. And the other reason, even if you did publish a fantastic study, which was well reported, well conducted, very transparent, found important results that could contribute to better care, one of the issues is that these journals are very poorly disseminated. So they're not included, largely they're not included in major medical databases like Medline, for example. So they're actually just very poorly disseminated and very hard to find. So they're not really going to contribute to advancing science or care if you can't actually find these studies. So that's another huge issue. So what does this actually mean then? Well, it actually represents a huge amount of waste. And if you think about the countless hours that academics and researchers put in to designing their studies, to getting ethics approval, to collecting data, analyzing that data, writing up in the submission process, what a huge waste of time from those academics and researchers who have invested so much time into these studies that aren't going to go anywhere. So this is just a huge issue. Also worryingly is if we think about preclinical or animal research, the amount of animals that would have to be culled or are culled after a scientific experiment in these studies that once again don't actually go anywhere or contribute to this translational pathway. What an absolute waste of these animals' lives. And of course, if we're looking at clinical studies, we're also wasting countless hours of clinicians and health professionals and our patients who are enrolling in these studies as well, because once again, those results may not be going anywhere. So incredible waste. And then finally, another huge issue and problem with predatory journals is that they can be a hotbed for pseudoscience and crackpots and snake oil salesmen and these types of this type of information, because of a lack of editorial standards and peer review. You can really probably get anything you want published. And the issue with this is that once an article has been published in these journals, at least to a lay audience, they may seem very scientific, but really it's probably more pseudoscience and could do a lot of harm. So this is so I think I've hammered on enough about why this is such a big issue. But encouragingly, there are now a lot of groups and initiatives that are trying to combat predatory journals, including steps to try to change models for payment for publication and making sure that if there are going to be incentives for publication, that perhaps these are only in legitimate journals. Hopefully being able to increase funding for open access publishing so that there is more funds to be able to publish in legitimate journals as opposed to predatory journals where the APCs are lower. And funders and governments can keep more stringent control of accredited journal lists and make sure that they are advocating or even forcing researchers that they fund to make sure they publish and disseminate their research in legitimate journals rather than these predatory journals. And of course, there are a lot of initiatives regarding raising awareness of predatory publishers. And there's been a lot of, it's certainly an area which is getting more focus and hopefully a lot of more awareness amongst potential authors, and obviously providing education as well. So this leads me to my next question. Considering one of the reasons that people may publish in these predatory journals is because they simply don't know they exist or don't know how to distinguish from a predatory journal from a more legitimate journal, I was wondering, have you received education or information regarding predatory journals from your institution? So let's have a look here. It looks like, well, this is quite encouraging. It looks like 41% of people actually have received education from their institution on predatory publishers. This is great to see. So obviously people are starting to hear about these and be warned about the pitfalls of publishing with predatory journals. So that's fantastic. But still, over half of you have not actually received any formal education or training from your institution on predatory publishers. So there's still a long way to go. Thank you for that. Okay, all right. So once again, just getting back to my example. So when I published with Hindley, it was once considered, depending on how particular criteria, it was once considered a predatory journal, but is now not. So how do you know? How do you tell? Well, once again, there is now some really useful guidance, and in this article from, that was published in Nature, which provided a definition, they also provided some criteria for predatory journals, which were all built into that definition. So if they do have false or misleading information on the journal website, if they deviate from best editorial publication practices, if there is a lack of transparency, and if they use these aggressive, indiscriminate solicitation methods, these are some red flags that it may be a predatory journal. Interestingly enough, there were some criteria that were left out of this definition. The quality of a journal, so how good the actual journal is, and the quality of a peer review as well, and whether or not the peer review is up to scratch. And then a willing intent to deceive as well. And basically, although these are criteria or factors that may be more associated with predatory journals, they are also more subjective and perhaps hard to measure and define. So they were left out of the official criteria from this definition. But there is some other meta-research that has been done, and this research, which has been led by Larissa Shamshir, who is very much an expert on predatory journals and predatory publishing, and we're very glad to have Larissa as part of our predatory publishing practices group here at JBI. This research actually did find a number of characteristics that are actually associated with predatory journals, and these can also be used to help identify if a journal is predatory or not. And then quite interestingly, this article, it's a good read if you ever get the time. Sometimes you can just tell by the name of a predatory journal, because they do have, they often have quite similar names to legitimate journals, but often have terms like international at the front of it, or global. And in this article, they provided this predatory journal name generator, where you can simply select a one title from each of these boxes to make your title for your predatory journal before breakfast, and no batteries required, as they say. Okay, so that's a bit of an overview on predatory journals and why they are such a big issue for science in general, really. And what I want to do now is get into predatory journals and systematic reviews and evidence synthesis. So up to now, much of the work regarding predatory journals has been focused on trying to stop people from publishing in predatory journals, to identify characteristics of predatory journals, and develop checklists, etc., to identify predatory journals. But there hasn't been a lot of work on what systematic reviewers should actually do when in the conduct of their review. And this leads me to my next question. Should we, as systematic reviewers, include studies or articles published in predatory journals in systematic reviews? And for those who conduct scoping reviews, should we include studies or articles from predatory journals in scoping reviews? So I'm very interested to see what the result is here and what people think. Well, isn't this interesting? Should we include articles or studies published in predatory journals in systematic reviews? 24% of the people on this webinar say yes, 32% say no, and then 46% say unsure. Okay. And then for scoping reviews, the results are somewhat similar, but a few more people think that we should include studies from predatory journals in scoping reviews. Very, very interesting. Thank you everyone for voting there. So what we can see here is that there is certainly, there appears to be at least, a lack of consensus about what we should do with studies from predatory journals in systematic reviews and scoping reviews and evidence synthesis more broadly, which is what's also been found in the literature as well. There is no universal guidance or consensus as yet about if we should include them or how we should deal with them in systematic reviews. And that's obviously one of the drivers behind the work of the group we've formed at JBI to try to investigate this issue more and perhaps come up with some of this guidance. But regardless of whether or not you think predatory studies from predatory journals should be included in systematic reviews or not, we do know that currently they are. And there is really this study here, which was led by Amanda Ross-White, who we're also very pleased to have on our predatory publishing practices group here at JBI, has actually found out that yes, predatory publications or studies from predatory journals are actually currently being included in evidence syntheses. So it already is an issue. And in this commentary from Jill Hayden, she also outlined some of the issues with predatory publishing and systematic reviews. And these are really two of the key articles that have been published so far on predatory publishing and evidence synthesis. But we still need, obviously, a lot more research and investigation. And in her article, Jill outlined some of the problems of predatory publications for systematic reviews, and also mentioned some potential solutions, particularly from a journal or editorial side. Now, what's come out recently, very recently actually, and is a really fantastic article, is what I think is one of the first, if not the first, meta-epidemiological study that actually investigated the impact of including studies from predatory journals in a systematic review. And in this article, also by Jill Hayden and colleagues, they actually looked at a Cochrane systematic review, which was on low back pain, and they identified what studies came from legitimate journals and what studies came from potentially predatory journals, and then investigated the actual characteristics of the studies from predatory journals and whether or not they impacted the results of that actual review. So a really interesting study looking at what is the actual impact on the results and the final effect sizes and effect estimates in a meta-analysis from predatory journals. They found that predatory journal publications weren't necessarily associated with patient outcomes, but other characteristics of poorly planned and reported studies do lead to an overestimation of the treatment effect. And they also found that trials published in predatory journals were more likely to have quality reporting and publication integrity issues, which obviously has been identified previously as well. So a really interesting meta-epidemiological study, and I think we probably need a few more of these studies to identify the impact of including predatory journals in our systematic reviews. Okay, so getting back to if we agree that we shouldn't, or if we take the approach that we shouldn't include studies from predatory journals in systematic reviews, then how do we stop it? Well, I think we probably have preventative approaches and then treatment approaches for predatory journals and studies from predatory journals in systematic reviews. We can take steps to make sure that the databases we're searching and the resources we're searching are less likely to have studies from predatory journals included. So we can try to reduce the chances of predatory journals sneaking in. But then also, once we've finished our study selection and screening processes, we could also then double check our studies and where they're coming from to see if they are coming from predatory journals, and then potentially they could be excluded if that is the approach that the systematic review team want to take. So there is some good news in that there are checklists that exist. So there are checklists to actually identify predatory journals. I guess the bad news is that there's 93 of these checklists, or at least there was a couple of months ago when I put these slides together. Who knows how many there are now. And very interestingly, I think as well, is that one of these checklists was published in a potentially predatory journal, which is a very meta, I would say. So quite interesting. And none of these checklists have as yet been identified as the perfect checklist, but basically the content of these checklists is, well, they are largely similar. And the things that they assess are the journal operations of a journal and how it's set up and the processes they have in place. It looks at communication between the journal and the publisher, it looks at article processing charges, and then how the journal is disseminated, indexed, and archived if it is archived. So I guess identification of predatory journals can be a little bit tricky when using these checklists, and not all predatory journals are likely to meet all these criteria on a checklist. And some of these predatory journals may be more predatory than others. And there's some issues with establishing a particular threshold or cutoff to determine when a journal can be categorically defined, I guess, as a legitimate journal or a predatory journal. And this threshold may actually move. But what I'd really like to know now is if anyone on the call has actually used a checklist in the past to identify a predatory or a legitimate journal. And if you have done this, it would be great to if you could mention in the chat perhaps the name of this checklist and whether or not you thought it was useful as well, just so that we can obviously learn from each other whilst we're on the call today. So people are, once again, they're filling out, and once again, I would encourage you all to get into a chat, and if you have used one of these checklists, to mention a little bit about it and whether or not you thought it was useful. So it looks like 13% of the people on the call have actually used a checklist in the past, whereas 87% of people haven't actually used one of these checklists. So that's very interesting. Thank you for sharing those that information. So, like I've mentioned now, one of the biggest issues is actually trying to define or distinguish a predatory journal from a legitimate journal, and deciding exactly where your cutoff or thresholds may lie. And one of the other issues is that some of these journals may not necessarily be predatory. They may actually just be a new journal, or just starting up and still trying to get the hang of some of these editorial processes, etc., that they need to adhere to as a journal, and starting to adhere to good standards, etc. So it may not necessarily be a predatory journal. It may just be a journal that is still establishing itself, which is another issue we should take into account. Now, a really useful resource to identify predatory journals, and also legitimate journals, and some key questions that you can consider when looking at journals, is the Think, Check, Submit website. And they have a lot of good guidance as well about how you can identify legitimate as compared to predatory journals, which I'd encourage you to look at. And of course, there are these lists of predatory journals as well. And I guess the most famous one is Jeffrey Beall's list of predatory journals, which no longer exists, which was eventually shut down, perhaps due to some of the correspondence and threats that Jeffrey Beall got from some of these large predatory publishers. But what's really interesting, I think, is looking at the evolution of how many publishers were included on this list of predatory journals. That back in 2011, there were only 18 entries on this list of predatory journals, whereas in 2017 there was more than 1,000. It just shows that this is a really, it's a growing problem. And there are also verified lists of legitimate journals as well. So the database of open access journals, you could perhaps consider as a verified list of open access journals which are legitimate. And then there are some other lists as well. But once again, there are some issues with all of these lists, and it doesn't look like there's a perfect list, at least at the moment. And you can see here that some of the time these lists actually disagree with their categorization of legitimate versus predatory journals. Now, in terms of searching, one thing that we need to be, I think, concerned about as systematic reviewers is that these predatory journals are infiltrating these medical databases that we may search. So a lot of articles are being identified in, say, PubMed Central due to NIH funding requirements and stipulations that they need to be indexed there. So this is a bit of an issue. And if we're searching Google Scholar, for example, you might be more likely to identify predatory journals as well. And the other ways that we might be including predatory journals in systematic reviews is if we are looking at reference lists of included studies, or doing onward citation screening as well. So we do need to be vigilant if we want to identify studies from predatory journals. Which leads me to my next question. If we find out an article from a predatory journal has somehow snuck in to our review, should we automatically exclude it? So let me bring up that poll now. What do you think? If somehow a journal has snuck into a systematic review, it's made it past the screening and selection process, but then at some later stage we find out it's actually from a predatory journal, should we automatically exclude it? Okay, so about 15% of you think yes, we should automatically exclude it. 39% say no, we shouldn't. And then the majority of people are not quite sure about what we should do. And once again, there seems to be a lack of consensus about what we should do. So once again, showing that we need more work in this field. So let's think about this. The issues with studies from predatory journals, they could be that the research is fraudulent, or that the research is subject to a lot of error, or that it's simply of perhaps poorer quality, or more likely to be of poorer quality. And I guess if it's going to be of poorer quality, then detecting low quality studies, or studies that are at more risk of bias, is relatively straightforward now. We have our tools, we have our processes, people are trained to do this in systematic reviews. So if we're including these studies in our systematic reviews, we have processes in place to assess their risk of bias and to determine if they're low quality or not. But if we actually want to check if there is error or fraud in these studies, it can be a little bit harder. And diligent peer review and traditional peer review may identify this, but most won't. And we've even seen some of the best journals, or more prestigious journals, should I say, be sometimes fooled by fraudulent work or work that has errors in it. And if we're really looking at error or fraud, even critical appraisal or a risk of bias assessment may miss this. So what could we do to try to really detect error or fraud if we have some sort of inkling that there may be an issue? Well, very careful and detailed investigation of numbers and totals may be needed. We may also choose to recalculate effect sizes or run analyses again to see if we can reproduce the results that are reported, if we have enough information, of course. We want to perhaps do very careful investigation of the timeframes and the sample sizes that are reported in the study to make sure that what the study itself is actually feasible. And they didn't actually just somehow recruit 10,000 people in 2 days' time and then analyze all that data the next week and then present their results, for example. And we may also do some forensic emailing to the authors and trying to get a lot of things clarified. So what else could we do in systematic reviews when it comes to predatory journals? And all of these points here have question marks at the end, because I don't think we really know yet. And once again, this is what we're trying to identify. Should we include a process to identify studies from predatory journals? If we're including studies from predatory journals, should we investigate their impact on any estimates of effect through subgroup or sensitivity analyses? Should we be doing some type of more in-depth risk of bias assessment? Or do we need additional checklists or approaches for detecting error or fraud? Should we be having even more contact with the authors if they're from predatory journals? Should we just straight out exclude them from our review, as some people have said we should do? Are there going to be any other changes to processes like grade if we include predatory journals? All of these are question marks at the moment that we hope to investigate. Okay, now I'm running out of time. I was going to discuss preprints and predatory journals and launch a poll, but I'll just get straight on to the issue here, I think, with preprints and predatory journals. Obviously, we've seen an explosion of preprints over the last 12 months, particularly with COVID-19. And some people have said perhaps because preprints haven't undergone peer review and studies published in predatory journals haven't undergone rigorous peer review, then perhaps we could deal with them in a similar fashion. Or perhaps they could be quite similar. I think one of the dealing with predatory preprints in systematic reviews is a whole nother issue completely. But I think one of the key issues between preprints and studies published in predatory journals is that preprints of studies that will eventually be published in more legitimate journals and will be eventually subjected to traditional peer review and that type of critique, so that they may be written in such a way, or there may be more, the authors may be more likely to adhere to standards of quality or reporting and make sure it's a well-conducted study. Whereas there may be a subset of authors who publish in predatory journals because they are actively trying to avoid peer review and quality checks. So maybe that's an important way to distinguish between preprints and predatory journals. And that's, so all of these are a lot of questions, and I think I've probably proposed more questions and answers in this webinar, but really just coming back to what we're looking at now in our group, in this Predatory Publishing Practices group, is we're trying to investigate this issue and actually develop some guidance, some education, and some advice for systematic reviewers about how we can address this issue in evidence synthesis. And what I'd love now also, if you have any suggestions or thoughts for our group, please do enter that into the chat. And just before we open the question and answer today, I just want to say a huge thank you to all of the members of the JBI Predatory Publishing Practices group and for their keen involvement in this important issue in evidence synthesis. But Tim, I think that is where I will stop. And hopefully we have some questions or comments from the audience.
Oh, we do, Zach. We do. So I am going to start with some of the questions that we got from Facebook first. So first of all, does open access, in your opinion, discourage publication in predatory journals?
So I think open access initiatives and the push for open access and open science and Plan S, I think it's probably more of a facilitator, if I be honest, for publishing in predatory journals, because predatory journals are open access and they charge these lower APC article processing charges. So this push for open science and Plan S, etc., could have the unfortunate downside, perhaps, of giving more weight or perhaps making these journals look more attractive, which is an unfortunate side effect, I guess, of perhaps the open science and Plan S, etc.
Okay, now a few questions from the Zoom call. Do you think, again, in your opinion, is there a relationship between publication bias and publishing in a predatory journal? So, for instance, articles with negative results may be rejected in non-predatory journals, and they may have more chance to be published in a predatory journal.
I think that's a really interesting hypothesis, and one that would be really interesting to investigate. I don't know which way the estimate of effect would go, whether or not you're likely to see more negative results published in predatory journals or more positive results because of the lack of because these studies are probably of lower quality. And I know that in the study by Jill Hayden, which was a meta-epidemiological study, they did find that there was no significant difference in terms of whether it's a positive or negative on the effect estimates from predatory journals or legitimate journals. But I do think this would be something that's very interesting to investigate. Regarding publication bias, I think there are some potentially some issues with predatory journals. One of the issues is, of course, if there are good studies that are published in predatory journals, they are often harder to find because they're not indexed in these major databases. So that could also be an issue regarding publication bias.
Alrighty. Can you speak about invitations to peer review for a potentially predatory journal?
So obviously some predatory journals will have some sort of peer review in place. The quality and the processes of peer review may vary widely. I think that's quite encouraging if a journal is inviting people to peer review. I'm not sure how much more I can speak to it. Maybe once again, I guess this is an idea of predatory journals are on this spectrum, or all journals are on this spectrum of legitimate and perhaps predatory, including the quality of peer review and their peer review processes. And I guess, I'm just thinking off the top of my head, if you receive an invitation from a journal to peer review, you should consider it like any other, but I'm not 100% sure on this issue.
Okay. Now, I know we're very close to time, but we have got a lot of questions here because this is a very hot topic. What do you see as the role of open peer review in a preprint ecosystem, and how does that influence inclusion into a systematic review?
That's a really good question. So broadly, I personally am in favour of open peer review. I think open peer review is a fantastic initiative, and I think it can really only help science overall. So I'm very broadly in favour of open peer review. In terms of peer review of preprints and open peer review, I think any system that facilitates credible feedback on research, whether it's a preprint or a published article, I think is very, very useful. And I think having the ability to provide comments on published research as well is also very, very useful, so that you can contribute to a debate. In terms of including then preprints in systematic reviews, and if they've had open peer review, I guess if you were coming from a position that you had concern about including preprints in systematic reviews because they haven't been peer reviewed, then this might be something that might allay your concerns. But the other thing is that I've heard someone mention that, well, if you're including a preprint that hasn't been peer reviewed in your systematic review, during a systematic review process, you can also essentially peer review it as the author of a systematic review. And obviously that could go hand in hand with your risk of bias assessment as well. But it's a very, very good, very interesting question.
Alrighty, and one final question, because I think this is very important for the nature of your talk today. I understand the problem with a predatory journal, but how can one remove a paper from a systematic review because it is suspected to be from a predatory journal if there are not clear guidelines how to identify what is or is not a predatory journal?
That's a fantastic question. That's something that we are looking at. If you were going to take that approach, so if you're going to take that very hardline approach, my only advice would be that you be very transparent in whatever cutoffs or thresholds or justification you're going to use. And I would also say that you should mention that a priori in your protocol as well. So for example, if you were going to say that if you wanted to take the approach, I'm not advocating for this approach, but if you wanted to take the approach that you were going to exclude studies from predatory journals in your systematic review, I think it would be good for you to say in your protocol something along the lines of, if we identify that a study is from a predatory journal as per the list, or as per Cable's list, for example, then we will exclude it, just to make sure that it is transparent along the whole way.
All right, thank you very much, Zach. Now, we do have many more questions. So if Zach hasn't been able to get round to your question, please feel free to contact him on Twitter or contact myself or anyone from the JBI Predatory Publishing Practices group. But thank you very much, Zach, for this fascinating talk and for answering very many questions. Now, before we finish, I just want to do a little plug for the next of our JBI live webinars. The next webinar will be hosted by Danielle Pollock and will feature Associate Professor Craig Lockwood. Now, Craig will be discussing qualitative synthesis, and he'll be discussing the importance and the reasoning for conducting a qualitative systematic review and the process in which we will synthesize qualitative information. So thank you very much for joining the webinar. At the end of this webinar, you will be given a link to fill out a survey. If you have the time, we would strongly appreciate all your feedback. More offerings will be through our JBI YouTube page and our JBI Education website. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining the webinar with Zach today.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, everyone.